Footsteps, footsteps, footsteps. The echo of his boots on the marble floor of the corridor seemed louder than usual, as if the whole world had decided to pay attention to the tension that Matt exuded. There was a faint smell of coffee in the air, mixed with the expensive wood flavoring used in the building. The light streaming from the tall windows seemed too bright, almost blinding, and Matt squinted, feeling the sweat running down his temples. He knew that he had made a mistake, maybe more than one, but the one that brought him here was certainly fatal. My heart beat dully, like a hammer hitting an anvil. Every step towards Dan Connors's office, adorned with a massive oak door, felt like a death sentence. Matt ran through scenarios in his head. Maybe it was some new employee's mistake and not his own. Maybe someone reported him? But how? After all, only he saw these transactions, their details hidden behind layers of numbers and codes. At the end of each month, everything looked perfect balance sheet, perfect accounting. He cleaned everything up, carefully and carefully, like a surgeon. Dan Connors, the owner of the company and a man who could not be ignored, was not one to scrutinize the details. His interests always revolved around glitz and glamour, expensive watches with diamonds, tailored suits in the best tailoring shops in the world, and, of course, an endless line of women who replaced each other faster than projects in the company. Everyone in the office knew all this, and Matt always consoled himself with the thought that in all the chaos, Dan would not pay attention to the small details in the accounting reports. But what if something has changed? What if this time they told Dan something or showed him something that Matt tried so hard to hide? With each new thought, his palms became more and more wet, and the collar of his shirt seemed to tighten around his neck. He stopped in front of the door. The name was engraved on the plaque in gold letters, Dan Connors, CEO. Matt took a deep breath. The oak door was closed, but from inside came the muffled sounds of conversations and the quiet rustle of paper. After hesitating, he extended a trembling hand and reluctantly knocked. The sound of his knuckles hitting the wood seemed too loud, like lightning striking the silence. Matt froze, waiting for an answer. It seemed to him that the door was about to open, and behind it would be not just Dan Connors, but his very destiny. Dan Connors sat at the massive black walnut, leather-trimmed desk, his face expressionless, but his eyes steely in determination. He leaned forward slightly, leaning on the table with one hand and pointing to the chair opposite him with the other. The gesture was laconic, but there was a sense of threat in it. Matt barely crossed the threshold, feeling his legs become weak. He took a few hesitant steps and sank into a chair, the leather upholstery of which made a muffled creak. The illusion of security that he had so stubbornly cherished was crumbling before his eyes. Dan began without prelude. "I guess the question is, how long have you been stealing money from me?" His voice was icy, like the blade of a knife cutting through the darkness. Matt felt dizzy. The world before his eyes suddenly darkened, and he could only stammer. "What? I don't understand what you're talking about." But Dan's look made it clear. It was all over. Matt's denials sounded weaker with every word he spoke, like a poorly played melody. Dan was in no hurry. He gave him the opportunity to become even more confused, and then opened the folder in front of him. Thick transaction logs with clearly marked lines, numbers, arrows. Every detail was in its place. Every line spoke louder than words. "What is this?" Dan asked coldly, pointing to the notes. His finger, decorated with a massive ring, slowly slid along the column of numbers. "It's clearly visible here. The money went to your personal account and then came back, but later. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Matt felt his breath hitch, and sweat ran down his back in icy streams. He tried to gather his strength. "I'm really sorry, Dan. I just needed a short-term loan until financing came through from the bridge company. Otherwise, we would have lost the new home that Susan loved so much. I didn't steal this money. I paid it back as soon as I could, and before the end of the month." His voice trembled, almost broke, as if he was short of air. But the words seemed to make no impression. Dan listened to him to the end, crossing his arms over his chest and tilting his head to the side, as if assessing whether he could even take this seriously. "I don't know how this is classified, Matt, as theft or fraud," he said finally, pronouncing each word slowly as if with pressure. But you are facing prison. Even if this doesn't happen, you will lose your job. I can't trust you anymore. The words hit Matt like a hammer. He froze, listening to the echo of these simple but deadly phrases. It seemed to him that the walls of the office were pressing on him, the air was becoming viscous, and his every movement caused excruciating pain. This is the end, he thought, looking at Dan's motionless face. Matt felt his face heat up. The words begged to come out, but each phrase seemed like a knife directed either towards him or towards Susan. He sat with his hands clasped so tightly that his fingers turned white. Please give me a chance. His voice sounded quiet, almost pleading. It was a moment of madness. I've worked for the company for almost 20 years and have never done anything like this before, and I won't do it again. I was desperate. Dan listened silently, then stood up and walked towards the large picture window. The sun's rays framed his figure, making it look almost monumental. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the noisy city that was seething with life below. You and Susan have been my friends for a long time, he said after a long pause, his voice cold, but not without a hint of regret. That's why it's so disappointing. Did she know you did it? This question turned out to be a blow, unexpected and painful. Matt froze. He hadn't expected Dan to ask this, and now his thoughts were a mess. Susan. Her face immediately appeared before her eyes. Her voice filled with worry as she assured him that this was just a temporary measure. We will return the money. No one will know anything, she said then, her eyes burning with hope. She was so attached to their new home, so afraid of losing it. Two forces fought inside him. One screamed that he should not set Susan up. The second whispered that the truth would emerge anyway, and it was better to admit it now. He knew that dragging her into this might tempt Dan to commute his sentence, but at what cost would that decision come? Matt took a deep breath and clenched his fists. The words came to him with difficulty, his voice trembled from tension. No, she didn't know, he said finally, avoiding Dan's gaze. It was my idea. Dan turned to him, his eyes now focused on Matt. The face expressed a mixture of distrust and contempt. Your idea, right? He asked dryly. You want me to believe that Susan didn't know? She has always been a smart woman. But if you claim that it is your fault, then you will be responsible. The word stung, but Matt knew he had chosen the right path. He couldn't drag Susan into this darkness, even if it might save him. Dan was surprised, but ignored it. I need time to think about this, Matt. I'm not sure what to do better. Go home. Don't come back until the end of the week. I'll make a decision on Friday. On the way home, Matt couldn't shake the depressing feeling. It was as if the car itself was leading him forward, but his thoughts wandered somewhere far away, as if in a thick fog. How did Dan know? This question kept coming back, hitting his mind like a pendulum. Nobody looked at the transactions. Everything was thought out to the smallest detail. Amounts, transfer times, accurate returns. But something went wrong, and now he stood on the edge of the abyss. Matt sighed heavily, turning his attention to the road. The branches of the trees along the highway, covered with a light frost, seemed cold and lifeless, like his own hopes. There were no good options ahead. Dan could have gone to the police. He could have terminated the contract. Any of this meant collapse, and that collapse would affect not only him, but Susan as well. He knew that Susan would not stay with him if everything fell apart. She always loved stability, comfort, home, this damned house for which it all began. When he saw the facade of their new abode, his heart sank. Huge windows, symmetry of shapes, immaculate lawn, all this now seemed like an empty shell, a reminder of stupidity and selfishness. Suddenly, a frightening thought came to mind. What if another blow awaits at home? He remembered stories about husbands returning early and finding their wives in the arms of their lovers. What if his nightmare day ended like this? This would be the perfect point to confirm his complete defeat. He braked, turned off the engine, and, pausing for a moment, took a deep breath of cold air. If only everything would be as usual, he thought, opening the door. Fortunately, Susan greeted him as she always did, with a joyful smile and in her usual, fully clothed manner. She stood at the kitchen counter, finishing up dinner service, the lamplight falling on her brown hair, styled in her usual elegant updo. Her bangs slightly hid her forehead, and the deep brown eyes that always fascinated Matt glowed with warmth. He paused in the doorway, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. Her beauty, which he had loved from the very beginning, seemed even brighter now, at almost 40 years old. She was no longer the model-figured young girl who had once captured his heart. New curves added over the years only made her more attractive, as if her body told the story of their common life. But what amazed him most was her smile. That smile that brightened up any day, no matter how gloomy the weather was. Matt knew that now he would destroy her for a long time. He suddenly felt the weight of the day pressing him down even more. Susan turned to him, her voice soft. "You're kind of tired. Everything is fine." Matt told Susan about his conversation with Dan and the overwhelming evidence he had. Susan looked at Matt with a guilty look in her eyes, folding her hands in front of her as if trying to protect herself from an invisible reproach. Her face, usually so confident and calm, now betrayed confusion and guilt. "Oh God, honey, I'm so sorry," she said, barely keeping her voice from trembling. "It's all my fault. It was my idea for this stupid house." Matt shrugged tiredly and looked away, looking at the floor as if he hoped to find answers there. "I told Dan that you didn't know anything," he answered calmly, but there was weariness in his voice. "There's no point in dragging both of us into this." Susan stepped closer, her brown hair falling over her shoulders, creating a soft contrast to her determined gaze. "Maybe I should talk to him and beg him," she offered, her voice full of sincere intention to help. Matt thought about it. The idea was tempting, but he quickly realized that it would likely only make things worse. Dan was a man of principles, and any pressure on him would have caused even greater irritation. Susan, with all her charisma, could play on their friendship, but what if Dan sees this as an attempt at manipulation? "No, it's better to wait," he finally said, leaning towards the table and leaning his hands on it. "It's useless to do anything now. If he chooses the worst option, then we'll try." Begging for mercy. His words sounded like a sentence, but Matt tried to hide his doubts. He knew that 3 of the longest and hardest days of their lives lay ahead of them. 3 days of uncertainty, filled with thoughts of what Dan would decide to do. He tried to imagine himself in Dan's place. What would he do? They were connected not only by work, but also by years of friendship. They often spent time together, business lunches, parties, casual meetings with families. Susan always got along with Dan's wife, and their companies seemed inextricably linked not only by business, but also by personal ties. Maybe this friendship will give him a chance. Maybe memories of good times will soften Dan's anger. Or will this only make the betrayal even more painful and the decision more severe? Matt sighed heavily and straightened up. "We still have time," he added, looking at Susan, whose brown eyes sparkled with tension. "We will act if everything goes according to the worst scenario." She nodded, but his words did not bring her any relief. There was silence in the room, broken only by the muffled ticking of the wall clock. Dan wrote that he would arrive at their house at 7 p.m. on Friday. Both Matt and Susan were sick from waiting. Right on time, Dan's Aston Martin pulled into the driveway. The man who has everything, Matt thought gloomily. Handsome, rich, able to charm, and now with a power to destroy his life. He opened the door, greeted him tensely, and Susan, as usual, offered him a beer. Before he could say anything, Matt spoke first. "I just want to apologize, Dan. I have failed you and myself greatly. I understand that I have put you in an impossible position, and I will accept any decision you make." Dan smiled strangely. "I hope you really mean it, Matt." The silence that followed became unbearable before Dan finally continued. "You know, I'm a little jealous of you, Matt. Your relationship with Susan. I miss this in my life." Matt sat in Dan's office, looking at him with wide eyes, as if the world had suddenly stopped being real. The words that had just been spoken seemed impossible, almost unreal. Matt always thought he knew Dan, charismatic, successful, with an endless list of women who admired him. The man who had everything. And suddenly this. He felt like everything was compressing inside, as if a vice of an unknown force was pressing on his chest. Panic overwhelmed him, but even against its background, his brain desperately searched for a way out. Susan. She was now in danger. She could be prosecuted because of the joint account. This was a fact that Dan did not fail to take advantage of. "You can't be serious," Matt finally whispered, his voice sounding hoarse, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his throat. Dan, on the other hand, looked surprisingly calm. He sat with his elbows on the back of his chair, his legs crossed and his palms on the armrests, like a king passing judgment. "I'm completely serious," he said in a flat, icy voice. "I've been wanting Susan for a long time. And this is an opportunity that I cannot miss." Those words hit Matt harder than any fist. He felt his head begin to ring, as if that statement had torn the fabric of reality. Dan wants Susan. It seemed absurd, something that could not even be imagined. And yet Dan continued, his face remaining impassive. "No police," he repeated, as if convincing not only Matt, but also himself of the justice of his offer. "No trials, no prison. You stay at work. You stay together. But I want to spend every Friday night with her." Matt felt his hands involuntarily clench into fists. He wanted to scream, to rush at Dan, but inside everything was as if paralyzed. His thoughts swirled around Susan. He remembered how they planned to buy a house together, how they discussed every detail, from the color of the walls to the arrangement of furniture. And now all this could be destroyed in an instant. But the worst thing was the thought that he might lose her trust. Matt was afraid to look into her eyes and see disappointment. He was afraid that his choice would ruin her life, either by allowing Dan to carry out this vile plan or by dragging her into a scandal with the police. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally, his voice sounding choked. Dan tilted his head slightly, his face remaining almost emotionless. "Because I can," he replied. "You have no choice, Matt. This is your only chance to save everything you have left." Matt couldn't believe his eyes. It seemed to him that he was watching a scene from some absurd film and not his own life. Susan, his Susan, stood in front of him and held Dan's hand. This moment hit harder than anything that had happened before. The world around him began to dim, the sound of voices became muffled, and anger and powerlessness filled every cell of his being. "You can't do this," he shouted, rising from his seat, but his legs were shaking. "Susan, think about it." She turned to him, her face remained calm, but there was pain in her eyes, which she tried to hide. "Matt," she said, her voice trembling, but the words sounded firm, "we have no other choice. If we refuse, everything will collapse." "Let everything collapse," Matt exclaimed, almost shouting. "You think that I can look at you, knowing that you... He couldn't finish. His chest felt tight as if he couldn't breathe. He looked at Susan, hoping that she would change her mind, that her hand would slip out of Dan's. But this did not happen. Dan stood nearby, his face expressing cold confidence. He knew that he had won, and this filled him with even more confidence. "It shouldn't be that hard, Matt," he said, as if he were talking to a child. "I offer a solution. You've painted yourself into this corner." Susan, still holding Dan's hand, nodded. "Everything will be fine," she whispered, as if she was trying to calm not only him, but also herself. She led Dan through the living room, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. Matt watched them disappear behind the stairs leading up. His legs seemed rooted to the floor. He could not move. When their figures disappeared, he collapsed back into his chair, feeling the world finally crumble around him. His hands were shaking, his heart was beating like a hammer. He tried to figure out how to fix everything, but every thought came up against a blank wall. As if in a fog, he heard the sound of a door closing upstairs. This silence seemed louder to him than the screaming, louder than the accusations and arguments that had happened just a few minutes ago. Matt covered his face with his hands, trying to hold back his tears. Anger, bitterness, and a deep sense of loss tore him apart. Time seemed to stand still for Matt. Silence reigned in the room. Did this conversation really happen? His thoughts instantly flew upward to where they were now. He heard their movements and muffled conversation, and then the distinct sound of someone sitting down on the bed. Matt felt like he was going crazy. Matt felt humiliated and guilty. He wiped his tear-wet eyes, waiting for Dan and Susan to come back downstairs. But instead, he heard muffled conversations and some movements. But what bothered him most was that his wife seemed to be enjoying it. Matt couldn't stand it. He ran out of the house and wandered aimlessly. Was Susan really enjoying this, or was she just playing a role for Dan? He began to wonder how actively she had resisted the idea. The fact that Dan was 10 years younger than him and also handsome did not escape his attention. When he reached the park, his thoughts changed direction. Susan is doing this to keep him out of prison. He needed to go home and make sure she was okay. When he returned, Dan's Aston Martin was still in the driveway, but the house was silent. Matt walked into the kitchen and opened a beer. Turning, he saw Susan in a short robe. They looked at each other, confused, before Matt choked out, "Are you okay?" Susan smiled slightly. "Yes, thank you for asking." Then she added, "Everything is fine. Nothing hard or weird, just regular sex. Sorry if you heard something." Matt shrugged. "Well, at least it's over." Susan looked awkward as she answered, Um, actually, he wants to do it again. He was thirsty, so I came for a beer and wanted to check on you." "Damn it, he must have been saving up his strength for this," Matt said. "Susan, maybe you should go to the office. It will be quieter there. Try to figure out how to get out of this situation." Matt sat in the office for another hour, still unable to find a solution, when he heard footsteps on the stairs. He walked out into the hall and saw Dan suppress a smile before breaking the tense silence. "Listen, Matt, I understand how hard it is for you right now. I promise to treat Susan with complete respect. I don't know how to thank you for allowing me to spend time with her. I hope you feel better with time. And of course, work issues will remain only between us." Matt, holding back his rage, replied, "No need to thank me. We had no choice." Dan and Susan looked awkward. It was clear that it was time for Dan to leave. To Matt's amazement, Susan kissed Dan goodbye. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but it lasted more than a second. Before Matt could say anything, Dan was gone. He looked at Susan. What the hell was that? Susan realized she had made a mistake. "What? Oh, it was just a goodbye kiss." "No, it was a sign of affection. Looks like you had a great time, and I was worried for nothing." Susan exploded. "I can't believe your boss just had sex with me because of your actions, by the way, and you're worried about a goodbye kiss." Matt, it was supposed to be just a deal, an arrangement, just sex. "Did you kiss him upstairs?" Susan, "Sometimes, yes, but not much." Matt, "Great. Firstly, this is not once, but 3 times. Then I hear that you like it, and now there are also manifestations of affection." Susan replied furiously, "This is wrong. Everything I do is to keep us out of jail. I have to show my willingness to make him happy. Plus, I can't help but pretend to like it when he does it to me. This is not a voluntary reaction that I can control. We'll both have to get used to it. If I can get through this, then you have to find a way to get through it." The last words drained Matt of all his strength. Despite his doubts about her actions, Susan sacrificed herself, not him. She could have just left, and then where would he have ended up? Probably in prison. Matt couldn't go to their bedroom knowing what happened there. Instead, they spent the night in the guest room, huddled together. Susan quickly fell asleep, no doubt tired, but Matt didn't sleep a wink. His mind was in constant turmoil, desperately trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. They barely spoke for the next week. The only discussions concerned how to get out of the current situation. Matt developed various plans, most of which turned out to be futile. Even when he came up with a viable solution, Dan seemed to be second-guessing his actions. One such plan involved destroying all evidence, but Matt discovered that he was already blocked from accessing the backups, and Dan stated that all financial data was now in a new secure cloud storage facility. After all, next Friday was approaching. Dan wrote that he wanted to take Susan to dinner under the pretext that things might be easier in such an environment. Matt wasn't sure if this would be any easier. On the one hand, dinner felt more like a date, but on the other hand, it meant less time in bed with Susan. In reality, everything turned out to be worse. Susan seemed depressed about the idea of dinner, but began to get ready. Matt thought she was trying too hard and looked too good when Dan came to pick her up. The sight of her in a little black dress and heeled sandals getting into Dan's Aston Martin broke his heart. The evening turned out to be real torture. Matt sent Susan several messages asking if she was okay. Each time he received short answers like, "Everything is fine, we're just having dinner," or "just drinking." They returned around 10 o'clock in the evening. Dan hugged Susan as they entered. They were both laughing and seemed in a good mood. Matt shot them a furious look. Susan seemed to be having too much of a good time and was clearly drunk. "We didn't agree that these would be dates." Dan replied, "Relax, Matt. It was just dinner and drinks between friends. If it's that hard, maybe we'd better go upstairs straight away." Matt was seething with anger. "What do you mean, straight to the top?" Dan's smile appeared again. "The deal was every Friday, Matt. So I'll stay with Susan tonight. I'm sure you can stay in the guest room." Drunk or not, Susan felt the tension and, fearing that Matt would attack Dan, took him into the kitchen, whispering, "Everything will be fine, dear. I'll deal with him quickly, and then I'll pretend to be drunk and fall asleep. Remember, we have no choice." Matt went into his office feeling completely helpless. He heard them go upstairs and Susan giggled. He hoped it was an act for Dan, but he couldn't help but think she was doing it for him. By morning, exhausted and angry, Matt came downstairs. Dan was already sitting at the table, and Susan was preparing breakfast. "Get out of here, Dan. Today is not Friday, and your time is up," Susan started to say. "Don't, Matt. We can be polite. It's just—" Matt interrupted her. "You have 10 seconds to get the hell out of my house." Dan looked like he was going to argue, but he stood up and headed for the exit. As he left, he reminded Matt, "Don't forget what's at stake, Matt." Matt turned to Susan. "Should I cook him breakfast? Seriously? You've got to be kidding me. Why don't you just move in with him? You are more his wife than mine." He stormed out of the room without even giving her time to respond. On the third Friday night, Dan again suggested spending the night at a hotel to avoid another confrontation with Matt. This proposal seemed reasonable, but Susan still felt tension inside her. Leaving home at 6 in the evening, she dressed as modestly as possible: jeans, a cozy sweater, and an inconspicuous jacket. Her goal was simple: to look as inconspicuous as possible so as not to attract unnecessary attention from Matt if he suddenly appeared. The weather was cool that evening, and a gentle breeze blew through her hair as she walked to her car. The ride to the hotel was surprisingly calm, but the closer she got to her destination, the more anticipation grew within her. As she parked at the entrance, the first thing that caught her eye was the grandeur of the facade: tall marble columns, golden light streaming from the huge windows, and the carpet leading to the front doors sparkling in the soft lighting. She walked inside and was immediately overwhelmed by the feeling of luxury. The huge hall was decorated with crystal chandeliers, sparkling like a myriad of stars, and the white marble floors reflected their light. The casual clothes she had chosen for comfort now seemed almost incongruous in such an environment. Even the hotel staff looked like they had just stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. After receiving her room key from the front desk, she took the elevator, which moved so smoothly that Susan barely felt it move. Her room was on one of the top floors, and upon entering, she literally froze on the threshold. It was a luxurious suite with huge panoramic windows offering breathtaking views of the city lights. Curtains made of delicate cream silk only emphasized the elegance of the interior. Soft sofas, elegant tables with gilded legs, and on the glass coffee table there was a vase with white roses exuding a delicate aroma. But the biggest surprise was waiting for her on the bed. On a perfectly made bed of snow-white linens lay 2 gift boxes with a silver tint. Her heart began to beat faster. She walked over carefully, sat down on the edge of the bed, and opened the first box. Her eyes widened when she saw the exquisite silver dress inside. The satin shimmered softly in the light of the chandelier, giving the impression that the fabric was created for the goddess herself. The cutout at the neck added elegance, while the slit at the thigh gave the look a sophisticated edge. She looked at the dress for a minute before deciding to open the second box. What she found inside made her blush slightly. The red satin corset, matching thong and black seam stockings all looked like part of some daring fashion show. Susan froze, feeling both embarrassed and strangely excited. She hesitated. Should I wear this? Perhaps this is too much. But curiosity and the desire to look perfect took over. Having tried everything on, she couldn't help but admire it. Her reflection in the huge mirror in the bedroom was almost unrecognizable. The silver dress emphasized her figure, and the sensual details of the lingerie added confidence. When she went down to the restaurant, she was accompanied by a feeling of lightness and inner triumph. The restaurant's interior was no less impressive. Tables with snow-white tablecloths, fresh flowers in vases, quiet music performed by a pianist. Every glance that fell on her confirmed that she looked stunning. And now, entering this new world, she felt like she was part of something special. Dan met her with his mouth open, amazed by her beauty. The dinner and wine were exquisite, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Susan found herself relaxing in Dan's company, choosing to follow her circumstances rather than resist them. In the morning, after another passionate night, Susan put on her casual clothes again. She explained to Dan that she couldn't risk taking the dress and lingerie home. Dan agreed to keep them for future use. Susan sighed, realizing that this would take a long time. Her emotions were in turmoil. She didn't know how to feel about all this. She felt guilty, but she couldn't deny the feeling of excitement and satisfaction. Matt couldn't sleep most of Friday night. On Saturday morning, at 10 o'clock, Susan still had not returned. This was already beyond their agreement. He doubted Dan could resist the temptation to sleep with Susan again, and he wasn't sure she would even try to avoid it. The more he thought about it, the more his distrust of Susan grew. If he loses trust in her, it could end their marriage. He had never felt so alone and distant from his wife. Susan. That kiss was a big mistake. That upset Matt the most, and then Dan's breakfast. What was I thinking? However, she was increasingly beginning to think that this whole arrangement was a terrible idea. From her perspective, her time with Dan had been easier than she expected. He was respectful, handsome, and interesting. Money and cars, of course, also played a role. She always liked beautiful things. The dilemma was that sex with him was hot, incredibly hot. She constantly had to fight desire. She hoped that Matt would get used to it and come to terms with it, but 3 weeks had passed and he remained gloomy. They also stopped making love, and Susan desperately wanted to fix that. She loved him so much and was sorry that everything had gone so far. She tried to tell Matt that she was handling the situation and that he shouldn't feel guilty. Then she added that Dan was good to her, that it was just sex, not real love, and that he was not trying to destroy their marriage. But it didn't affect Matt at all. He seemed broken and lost. His confident and reliable presence was becoming a distant memory. When he arrived at work on Monday, Dan informed him that Matt needed to be sent to on-site training on Wednesday and Thursday. Matt immediately became suspicious, but given his precarious position at work, he had no choice but to agree. Okay, I can cover this, but this has nothing to do with our personal agreement. You can't visit us while I'm gone. Dan replied, Of course, of course. When he told Susan that night, she didn't seem surprised or worried. Such courses were rare, but they occurred once or twice a year. However, it looked too suspicious for Matt. He went to his office, intending to develop a plan to get out of the situation, but his headache prevented him from concentrating. As he went upstairs to get some painkillers, he heard Susan's voice talking on the phone. The words caught his attention, and he began to listen to her side of the conversation. What are you doing sending Matt on a trip? No, this is a bad idea. None of this works, and your appearance will only make things worse. No, he hasn't come up with anything yet. It seems he gave up and just put up with it. This is not how I imagined everything. He's depressed. You know I like spending time with you. I know it was my idea, but I didn't expect him to feel so bad. It was supposed to be a safe alternative to having an affair, without the risk of getting caught. I didn't mean to let it come to this. I made the situation worse with the kiss and breakfast, and you were a smug asshole, laughing behind his back. Okay, you can come while he's on his trip, but then we either have to stop this or be much more careful. If you suggest stopping this because you see how it's affecting Matt, you can look like a hero and we can get back to normal. Perhaps, if you're careful, we can still meet sometimes. We'll talk later, but I really need to make things right with Matt. I still love him. Matt froze, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. He couldn't believe what he just heard. All the words sounded deafening. Now it became clear why Dan anticipated all his plans. Susan told him everything in advance, and it was her idea from the very beginning. She proposed the scheme and convinced Matt to borrow the money, despite his doubts. It also explained how Dan found the financial discrepancies. They were so carefully hidden that even an audit would hardly have noticed anything. Far from being the saintly wife who saved him from prison, Susan was in fact a traitor. Matt felt himself overcome with rage, thoughts of revenge flashing through his mind. Everything was too cumbersome and confusing. He knew he had to calm down and think rationally. He needed a plan that would make them both feel the same anxiety that he felt. Matt avoided Susan for the rest of the night and the next day. When he saw her Tuesday night, he made no mention of the overheard conversation, but said he heard Dan at work bragging about a first-class woman's booty. Matt added that he could only pray that Dan didn't mention Susan's name. Matt left early Wednesday morning for a trip, and Susan, as always, told him she loved him. Matt forced a smile and pretended to be focused on the schedule on his phone as he left. Later on Wednesday, Dan came to see Susan. She immediately asked him about bragging, but Dan denied everything, accusing Matt of provocations. Susan wasn't sure who to believe. Matt had no apparent reason to come up with something like this, but maybe Dan was less careful than she thought, which could cause problems. Between fits of passion, they discussed the current situation and what could be done about it. Susan missed her emotional connection with Matt. She only had physical attraction with Dan. Before leaving on Thursday afternoon, Dan convinced Susan to continue their romance, but she made it clear that this would be their last time together until she mended her relationship with Matt. When Dan left the house, he stopped in his tracks. On the shiny hood of his Aston Martin was a large kitchen knife, stuck perfectly into the metal. All 4 tires were punctured. He returned to the house and told Susan about it. They both started to panic. Was Matt back early? What did he know? They were sure it was him, unless there were children or someone was jealous of the car. This is not the first case of vandalism. Susan called Matt asking how the trip was going. He calmly replied that she was incredibly boring and said that he was just starting to return home. He sounded unfazed and didn't ask about Dan. Susan recounted the conversation to Dan, saying Matt didn't seem upset. Perhaps they were just hooligans. However, the car had to be towed before Matt could return, requiring several calls and expensive services. When Matt returned Thursday night, everything seemed normal. Susan walked on tiptoes, pretending to be a good wife. However, Dan sent a message that he wanted to come over on Friday to discuss their situation. Susan thought that maybe Dan wanted to end their relationship. The attack on the car probably scared him enough. On Friday morning, Matt went to work as usual. At 11 a.m., he called Susan in an excited voice. "Susan, you should see this." He explained that he received the video clip in their personal email. Susan opened her email on her phone, found the message, and watched the video. It was of poor quality and only lasted 20 seconds, but it clearly showed her and Dan having sex. The sender was anonymous. Matt asked, "Lord, is this our bedroom? In the video it's sunny, like it's the middle of the day. When was this?" Susan knew exactly what it was on Wednesday when Dan was with her. She remembered this moment. But she answered, "I'm not sure." Maybe the lighting has been edited. Matt continued. It's you, right? You're clearly enjoying this. Susan ignored this comment. She had more important things to worry about. She could explain her enthusiasm later as part of a game with Dan. Matt said, "What kind of game is Dan playing? Is this what he wanted to talk about tonight? Is this another form of torture? Did you happen to quarrel with him or threaten him?" Susan categorically denied this, but then remembered that she told Dan about her intention to stop everything. He may have reacted poorly to this and used the video to maintain control. Matt said Dan wasn't at work, so he couldn't ask him directly. Susan desperately wanted to contact Dan to understand what was going on and still hoped to somehow hush up the situation. Then her phone rang. It was her sister Diana, who wrote a message with the note, "Urgent, call me." Susan told Matt she had to answer the phone, thinking it would give her some time to think. She ended the call with Matt and immediately called Diana back. There was a stream of indignant questions and curses on the phone. As Diana paused to catch her breath, Susan was able to realize that her sister had also received the video clip. Her phone did not stop ringing with constant calls from her friends, relatives, and even her mother. Did they all really get this video? This is a disaster, Susan thought. She was sure Matt would never do this, so it could only be Dan. In anger, she began to call him again and again, but he did not answer. The reason she couldn't reach Dan was because Matt intercepted his phone at work while he was in a meeting. He took out the battery and SIM card and hid the phone. Before that, Matt left an envelope on Dan's desk and left. He then called Susan about the video and calmly went home. When he returned, Matt watched with pleasure his wife's confusion and suffering. She was killed by the fact that her mother and loved ones could see this video, and also by the fact that now everyone would know about her betrayal. Matt pretended to try to help. He offered nonsensical ideas on how to minimize the damage and pretended not to understand when the video might have been taken down. Susan stubbornly refused to admit that Dan had been with her during the week. Susan. How could it have gone this far, she thought. She had never thought about cheating before until she got drunk at a party and started flirting too openly with Dan. He was handsome, charismatic, and clearly interested. After that night, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Over time, she convinced herself that she deserved a little excitement in her life, but she wasn't about to risk her marriage to Matt. She remembered how her friend's marriage fell apart because of a similar affair, so she came up with a plan that she thought was a smart way to avoid detection. After all, how can you reveal a secret that is already known? Working out the details was part of her excitement. From her point of view, it was a brilliant idea. She didn't realize the damage it was doing to Matt until it was too late. Now everything has turned into a nightmare. Everyone loved Matt, and now everyone will know that she betrayed him. She was afraid to even imagine how she would have to explain this. No one will believe that Matt knew about her meetings with Dan. Before she had time to process her thoughts, she heard the screech of brakes in the driveway. It was Dan. He jumped out of the car, and Susan rushed at him, starting to scream and try to hit him. Matt didn't interfere, watching the scene with interest. Dan managed to grab Susan's wrists and pin her against the wall. "I heard about the video, but I wasn't the one who shot it, and I wasn't the one who sent it," he said. Susan shouted furiously. "If it's not you, then who?" Matt laughed. "I think it was me." Susan and Dan stared at him, shocked. Dan was the first to realize what was happening. "So you knew we met this week?" he asked. Matt nodded calmly. "Alas, I knew." Susan began to make excuses, claiming that this was all part of their agreement. But Dan quickly realized that Matt was recording their conversations. In a panic, he tried to save the situation. "Matt, I'm really sorry. This was a mistake. I just couldn't resist Susan. I never meant to hurt you. Let's forget about it. I will stop our meetings and forget about financial issues." Matt chuckled. "Oh, how nice of you. But I'm afraid it's too late. You will find my resignation letter on your desk." Susan chimed in. "You can't leave, Matt. How will we pay off the mortgage on the house?" Matt, still calm, replied, "Don't worry, dear. The house will be put up for sale tomorrow. Dan tried to keep the situation under control. Matt, that's not necessary. We can leave everything behind. I need you in the company. You know the business and clients like the back of your hand. Matt chuckled. It's true, Dan. I think that's why your main competitor offered me the job. I suspect that many, if not most, clients will switch to me. And since I've accumulated more time off than is required for 4 weeks' notice, you can assume I won't be coming back. Dan's smile disappeared. He finally realized how difficult the situation was. I think a lot of the staff are going to leave too. I told them I was leaving, and most of them don't think you have what it takes to keep the company afloat. Dan retorted, You should think it over, Matt. You could still end up in jail. Matt, Oh, I don't think so. Would you want to drag your lover into this? She received half the benefit from the fraud. Besides, you committed blackmail, and thanks to your fun, I have this confession on video. It's amazing what electronic devices you can buy these days. My lawyer has the recording now. In addition, you may find that some of your files were mistakenly deleted. I also know that you didn't save anything remotely. It's very helpful to have colleagues who love working with you. But I don't think you know that. Dan grinned. This video will never be accepted in court. Matt replied, It's funny, my lawyer said the same thing. But I can use it in another way, and by the time everything is resolved, you will already be bankrupt. On the other hand, my new company might want to buy yours. I heard they have a new director of operations, a great guy. Susan realized that Dan's business and his money were in serious danger. She decided to blame everything on Dan. Dan listened in disbelief as Susan began her impressive performance as a wronged woman. I love you, Matt. This was all Dan's idea. He made me do it. I admit I got confused and got a little carried away, but I was just following his instructions to keep you out of jail. I had no other choice, and because of this my life is ruined. Please, Matt, I love you, Dan muttered. Lying, two-faced bitch. Matt smiled, noting how apt the description was. Ah, my dear loving wife, besides the video, you are missing the fact that I overheard your conversation on the phone where you admitted that it was all your idea. A very sophisticated and cruel way to cover up an affair. You will find the divorce papers in an envelope in the kitchen drawer. You leave tonight and agree to the terms of the divorce. Otherwise, a few more videos could end up in the hands of your family and friends. I'm sure your mom will love to know that you are not only a cheating wife, but also the extent to which you have gone in your intrigues. Susan burst into tears and fell to the floor. Matt looked at Dan. Do you want to take her with you? Dan. No way, too much trouble. Matt. Well, we agree here. Dan. It's not over yet, Matt. Matt. This is true. With that, Matt hit Dan. Now it's over. Matt listened to the recording more than once. It was excruciating, but he loved the part where Dan and Susan worried about whether he was going crazy. The knife in the hood was a wonderful piece of melodrama, and the action brought a smile to his face for the first time in weeks. Life fell apart for all three of them, like branches of a tree that break under the weight of time and decisions. Matt, having gathered the remnants of his will, not only survived the betrayal, but also found a way to use it as motivation. An offer from Dan's competitor turned out to be a lifeline, and he jumped at it without hesitation. Clients who had long been disillusioned with Dan's leadership and employees dissatisfied with his methods followed Matt. Dan's company began to burst at the seams. He managed to stay afloat for some time, but problems grew like a snowball. When rumors about the company's bankruptcy became a reality, followed by news about his personal debts, this became a kind of confirmation for Matt that justice still exists. Dan quietly left the area, leaving behind no friends or respect. His luxurious life ended as suddenly as it began, leaving only an empty shell. Susan stayed to live in a small, modest apartment. After selling their house, she received some of the money, but it was not enough to maintain the standard of living she was accustomed to. With no experience or qualifications, she found herself working 2 temporary hourly jobs while trying to make ends meet. Her brilliant life collapsed, and along with her went the friends who once willingly shared her joys. Communication with his mother and sister became minimal, probably due to feelings of shame. Matt chose a different path. With an increase in salary, he allowed himself to reduce the work week to 3 days, devoting the rest of his time to sports and active recreation. He sold their large house, deciding to leave the past behind him, and began to spend more time with his loved ones. He especially established contact with his mother and sister Susan. Susan's sister, Diana, proved to be the most supportive of the family. She often apologized for her sister's actions, but there was something more than just regret in her apologies. Once she even said, "Matt, know that I would never do that." These words stuck in his head. What did she mean? Was it just a consolation, a hint of her support, or something more? The thought of finding out began to play in his mind. He understood that such a decision might infuriate Susan, but now, after a while, he felt stronger, freer. Matt decided that one day he would find out exactly what Diana meant. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.